Unit 3. We are jumping to Unit 3 primarily and calling it Unit 3 because this matches up with Chapter 3 in your textbook. We had Unit 0 and Unit 1, and there was a point in time where we thought about renumbering Unit 0 and Unit 1 and calling those 1 and 2. That way everything would just be really nice and flow into it. Didn't get around to it. Sorry, this is how it goes. You guys can be flexible. We just Unit 3, doesn't matter if we call it Unit 7, 18, 25, Z, doesn't matter. Okay? Unit 3 is on congruent objects. Everything after Section 1 is going to deal with a triangle. That's a main idea of this unit. We'll be dealing with triangles. Triangles is a huge, huge part of geometry. What we're going to do in Section 1 is we're going to primarily focus on congruent polygons. That could be any shape. It could be 3 sides like a triangle, or 4 sides, or 5 sides. Any shape that is congruent to another one. We actually have a symbol for the word congruent. When you see this equal sign with a little bar on top of it, a little wave over it, that means congruent. Anytime you want to write the word congruent, you can abbreviate it by just showing me the symbol for congruent. Congruent means that it's equal and similar. Equal in measure, it's the same size, it's the same shape. If something has all sides that are congruent and it has all angles that are congruent, then it is a congruent polygon. If I know that all the angles in this one are congruent to all the angles in this one, and all the sides are congruent to all the sides in this one, they're matching, then I know that the two objects are congruent to each other. You are going to have to decide in the homework whether two things are congruent or not. And your only way right now to tell whether two things are congruent, are all their sides congruent, are all their angles congruent. If they are, bam, you can say that they are congruent to each other. The only way you can get around their angles being congruent to each other is this other thing called the third angles theorem. If all the sides are congruent, awesome, but all their angles have to be congruent unless two of their angles match two of the other angles. Their third angles are going to match because all three of these add to 180, all three of these add to 180, these two are the same, these two are the same, so the third angle has to be the same as the other one. There's a theorem called the third angles theorem. So if I know that all three sides are the same as each other in two objects, and two of their angles match, you can assume the third angles match and that the two objects are congruent. That's the reason why this is in your notes, just so you know. If you were to look at this picture and this is the same as this, I know that they're congruent because there's a single arc and a single arc. That means that those two pieces are congruent. They have the same measure. If it has a double arc, it means it's congruent to the other double arc, and that it's most likely different than the single arc. It could be the same, could be different. If these angles match up, are these two objects congruent to each other? Your answer should be no. In order for things to be congruent to each other, they have to have congruent angles and congruent sides. Do you see any marks here that tells you that this side is the same as this side? Do you see any marks here that say that this side is the same as that side? So what you could have is you can have a triangle that, let's just throw out some numbers, 30 degrees and 45 degrees and 45 degrees. They match, the angles match. Well, does that mean that the sides also match? We're not sure. These may not be congruent to each other. Their angles are, but the polygons, no, they are not necessarily the same. I'm hoping that makes sense to you. So let's go with the beginning parts of this whole thing. If I have this is congruent to that, if I have a congruent statement, it says polygon A, B, C, D is congruent to polygon E, F, G, H. What this is telling you is that this angle here matches up with that angle there. A matches up with E. It's telling you that side AB matches up with side EF. It's telling you that BC matches up with FG, and so on. The congruent statement is written in something called corresponding order, meaning the parts match. Angle D matches up with angle H. It has to be written that way. But it doesn't always have to start in alphabetical order. You can write it in any way you want. So the very first problem that I have for you is write the congruent statement in two other ways. This is a congruent statement. I can write it in different ways. I can start with any letter I want to. Matter of fact, I can start with the letter C. Actually, let's do it this way. I'm going to start. Let me make sure my pen color is red. And I'm going to start with B just because I like BAD, bad C. Let's do that. Polygon bad C is congruent to. If I start with B, and then I go to A, then I go to D, then I go to C, that is congruent to, there's only one specific order of the four letters that I can use. The first letter needs to be what letter? Say it out loud. The second letter needs to be what letter? Say it out loud. The third letter needs to be what letter? Say it out loud. And the last letter needs to be? Wonderful. This is another way to write the same congruent statement. And if you notice, B is still lined up with F. A is still lined up with E. And so on. That's one way. You could even start with the other triangle or the other polygon first, like polygon H, E, F, G. Polygon HEFG is congruent to, it still has to line up though. It has to be a matching order. If you know all four letters that it has to be in, go ahead and tell the person you're sitting next to what the four letters are. If you said DABC, please raise your hand. That is over half the class. I think I see about 90% of you have your hands raised. There you go. If it says this, then you know that the two polygons are congruent. It's even telling you what matches up. As a matter of fact, you can even name four pairs of corresponding angles. You can even name four pairs of corresponding sides. What that means is you now know, because of this congruent statement, that angle A is congruent to another angle. Angle A is congruent to angle E. You will need to write an angle symbol. An angle symbol looks like a little L, sort of. It's kind of horizontal on the bottom and then about a 45-degree angle to the up to the right. Angle A is congruent to angle E. That is one pair of corresponding angles. I bet you know what the other three are. If you know what they are, write them down. If your four pairs are angle A is congruent to angle E, angle B is congruent to angle F, angle C is congruent to angle G, and angle D is congruent to angle H, please raise your hand so I can see how many wrote that down. Wonderful. That's over 90% of this class. Good job. It is very simple. You could have easily done the right letter first and the second letter second, and that would have been also correct. I just want to make a note that now that we are transitioning into geometry, half of geometry is knowing how to write things. So using angle symbols is going to be worth a 1-pointer. Meaning, on a test, if you do not put the angle symbol and you're talking about an angle, you will not get the full credit in Honors Math 2. If we're talking about a side, we need to be using segments. So I want to see segment bars when we're talking about the side of a polygon. For example, 4 pairs of corresponding sides. I know that side or segment AB, this side, is going to be congruent to segment EF. I'm going to write it with a segment bar on top because it ends. It has 2 end points. The geometry teachers that I know are very specific about how you write a segment. It needs to be bars. It's not a ray. It's not a line, and so on. If you do not put the bar, it means the length of, and we're not talking about the length of. We're talking about 2 sides being congruent, the same length, but not an actual measurement. That's what I mean. Okay, so AB is congruent to EF. We have other sides. We have segment BC. We have segment CD. We also have side AD or DA. It's the same way forwards or backwards for a segment. Meaning, I could have said AD or I could have said segment DA. It's the same segment. It doesn't matter which letter you start with. But if we're doing 4 pairs, BC is going to be the same as segment FG. CD is going to be the same as segment GH. You could also say HG. It would be the same because you can say it forwards or backwards. AD, the same one is EH. Fairly simple. Those are all the basic. You can handle that. You can handle the first the first 5 questions of homework. That's really how it's going to work. But just because I gave you a picture does not necessarily mean that you always have to have a picture to do your answers. This is number 8 from your textbook. If you want to go to number 8 in your book, turn to page 126, look for number 8. You can do this in your book if you would like to. It is up to you. Or if you want to have it in your notes, you can do that as well. On number 8, your first homework question says, this is given. What is this congruent to? And I wrote down up here, you don't necessarily need a picture if you have a congruent statement. Just because I gave you a picture the first time doesn't mean that you have to have one. If they tell you that triangle QXR is congruent to triangle NYC, then you should know all the angles are congruent to each other, all the sides are congruent to each other. So if side QX is congruent to what side, you should be able to answer that just looking at the given statement. If you know what it is, go ahead and tell me what the 2 letters are you're going to, well actually, you should say segment something, or something, something. 2 letters. If you know what that is congruent to, go ahead and say it out loud. Segment NY. When you say the word segment, you're telling me you're going to put a segment bar on top. That's what you're telling me. You're verbally stating what you're going to do in written form. Angle Y is going to be congruent to, say it out loud. I appreciate those of you who said angle x because, those of you who said that, you means you're going to write down the angle symbol when you write it down. If you just said x, you might get a -1 on your test because you forgot the small stuff, right? I'm trying to make all of you a 100% student. Last example is number 14. This is number 14 in your textbook. You are welcome to do this in your textbook if you would like. You are able to write in your textbooks. And as a matter of fact, you need to start bringing your textbooks to class because when I stamp homework, I need to see that you did it. And so it is what it is. Okay? Number 14. Walter sketched the diagram to the right. He claims that it shows that the two polygons are congruent. What information is missing to support his claim? He thinks this is congruent to this. But there must be some missing information. What else does he need to know in order for these to be congruent to each other? It's missing congruent angles. You can write out the words if you want to. I'm very much a symbol person. I will write down the symbols as much as I can. Congruent, here's congruent angles. We know all these sides are the same, but we don't know if this angle is exactly the same as that angle and vice versa. They look the same, but you cannot assume things in geometry. And so that's where we're going to end our notes today.